Well, good day, and welcome to the Kela Show. It's an honor to see all of you lovely faces in our studio audience today. Let's get to it. Today on our show, we have world-renowned anthropologist Nikila Ramdanson, who has spent her life studying different societies and their cultures. But today, she'll be speaking to us about her recent work with globalization in Latin America, Africa, and the Caribbean. Audience, please help me in welcoming Nikila Ramdanson. Welcome to the show, Nikila. It's an honor to have you here. I've been waiting so long to meet you. So, tell us about yourself. Well, I'm very honored that you invited me on your show. You asked about me. Oh, well, of course, my name is Nikila Ramdanson. I'm 19, one of the youngest anthropologists ever. I take pride in my work, and recently I've been doing studies of globalization in Latin America, Africa, and the Caribbean. So, like you said, you are the youngest anthropologist ever. And how does that feel? Well, to be the youngest anthropologist ever, I'm excited and grateful that I could make such history in the world. So tell us, what really made you want to become an anthropologist? What made me want to become an anthropologist? Well, at an early age, I saw and acted myself to do research about different places and their culture, and I was really interested in such a topic, so why not make it a career for myself? Because you are one of the best, shall we play a little question and answer game? We're about to play a game. I hope I'm ready and prepared with the answers for you guys. Question number 1. Tell us about Latin America, Africa, and the Caribbean. Well, the non-Western countries of Latin America, Africa, and the Caribbean comprise a complex of diversified regions and cultures that cannot be easily characterized. The various countries in these regions are located in different types of environmental zones, ranging from high mountain areas to low river valleys, and from small island regions to complex urban centers, with various ethnic groups in different proportions, which puts them all in different stages of political and economic development. Question number 2. Can you please tell us Christopher Columbus's role in Latin America? After Christopher Columbus's exploration in the 1400s, Spanish and Portuguese conquistadors led expeditions in the Americas. This was a period of mercantilism. Portuguese and Spanish were the first Europeans to engage in this mercantilist competition. The primary objectives of the conquistadors were to find wealth, build their national treasuries, and conquer the Americans. Question number 3. Can you please describe Latin America? The indigenous society of Latin America consisted of 4 major types of sociocultural systems: small-scale hunting and gathering bands, heteroculturalist tribes, chiefdoms, and agricultural empires. Question number 4. What was the result of the Treaty of Tordesillas? In 1494, the Treaty of Tordesillas was mutually agreed upon by the Spanish and Portuguese governments, which divided the world into 2 major mercantilist spheres of influence, resulting in the Portuguese control of what is now Brazil, and Spanish gained access to the remainder of Latin America. Question number 5. Describe the Spanish's role in Latin America. In 1519, Hernando Cortes confronted the Aztec Empire in Mexico. This became the first major altercation between the Spanish and the indigenous people. The Spanish then went on to conquer Mesoamerica, which included Mexico, Honduras, and Guatemala, as well as areas in southeastern and southwestern North America. The Spanish ransacked these civilizations, taking the gold, silver, precious stones, and other valuables. Spanish began to exploit this wealth for their own country by developing mining, commercial agriculture, livestock raising, and trading. Question number 6. What did the Portuguese do with Brazil? The region of Brazil contained no productive agricultural states, and the native population consisted of only about 1 million people. This made Portuguese search elsewhere for wealth. They turned immediately to developing commercial agriculture and introduced sugar plantations. The plantations required local labor, but due to few natives in the area, the Portuguese also imported African slaves. Question number 7. How did explorers reach Africa? On their journey seeking gold, the Portuguese explorers reached the West African coast in the 15th century. Although they did not find large amounts of gold, they did discover another source of wealth: slaves. Question number 8. Can you please explain slavery to us? Slavery existed throughout much of ancient agricultural world, including Egypt, Greece, Rome, the Middle East, and parts of Africa. However, in African agricultural states, war captives and criminals were kept as slaves. The Portuguese initiated the major European slave trade when they took slaves from the West African coast and sent them to Portugal or the islands. As a result, African slaves became the major source of labor in the vast growing plantation systems located in North and South America, Portugal, and Holland. By the 1700s, England and France became the dominant slave trading nation. Question number 9. Now can you explain the classification of slavery? In Africa, slaves could own property and were allowed to marry. Also, they were protected from murder. However, in Western countries, slaves were classified as property. They had no personal rights. They were traded to Europeans for goods and weapons. Question number 10. How was the slave trade? In the early 19th century, the Atlantic slave trade declined when Britain and France led anti-slavery movements which led to the prohibition of slave trading. British ships were sent to patrol African coasts to capture slave traders. However, many avoided the British. Slave trade through Britain ended in 1808. However, the complete abolition of this slave trade was not yet possible until plantation systems were abandoned. In 1865, the United States made slavery illegal. However, the trade still affects Africa to this day. Let's take a little commercial break and we'll be right back.
Show it, and I'm moving when I do it. I could be bad if I want. I can go slow all night long. Embrace your past, but live for now. Now I run this, 'cause I put it.
We were below the 88th southern parallel. We had traveled for over 850 miles. My men driven nearly mad from starvation and frostbite. Today we make history.
Bienvenidos! Welcome to the South Pole!
If you're Dora the Explorer, you explore. It's what you do.
What took you so long?
If you want to save 15% or more on car insurance, you switch to Geico. It's what you do.
You did it! Yay!
And we're back to the Kela show. We're here with anthropologist Kela Ramdanson. Let's resume our game. During the late 19th century, European nations began to compete for African territories. To serve their needs of raw materials and oversea markets, the British, French, Dutch, Belgians, and Germans portioned different areas of Africa into colonies, which some are still presently used. The British, French, and Germans established commercial enterprises to control the production and exportation of products. King Leopold of Belgium made Congo a private preserve where he controlled the economic aspects of the region through ownership of countries that allowed the development of rubber and ivory trade. However, because of his harsh treatment, he decreased the population by one half. In 1880s, the Germans and British competed for various territories, which resulted in treaties which gave the colony of Kenya to the British and Tanganyika to the Germans. Question number 12. Can you geographically describe the Caribbean? The Caribbean islands consist of four distinct geographical regions: the Bahamas, the Greater Antilles, which includes Cuba, Hispaniola, Jamaica, the Cayman Islands, Puerto Rico, the Virgin Islands; the Lesser Antilles, which includes Antigua, Barbuda, Dominica, Saint Lucia, Saint Vincent, the Grenadines, Grenada, Saint Kitts, Nevis; and lastly, off the coast of South America, Trinidad and Tobago, Barbados, Aruba, Curacao, and Bonaire. Number 13. Explain the division in the Caribbean. By the 1500s, Cuba, Haiti, and Puerto Rico were under Spanish rule. Other islands were divided among the British, French, and Dutch. Unlike the mainland states, these islands did not have any treasures, which is why colonial powers introduced commercialized agriculture, which were the sugar plantations. Because of these plantations, African slaves were imported for labor. However, when the slave population began to decline, British replaced slave labor with East Indian workers, which makes the Caribbean islands very diverse. Question number 14. Explain the population in the Caribbean. The immediate impact of the West on Mesoamerica, South America, Africa, and the Caribbean were dangerous for local populations. They began to decline drastically. One of the major reasons for this decline was the introduction of diseases such as smallpox, measles, influenza, and mumps. In Brazil and the Caribbean, African slaves introduced malaria and yellow fever. Rapid depopulation was also due to the stresses caused by the new forms of labor. In addition, the collapse of the indigenous patterns of agriculture brought about famines and food shortages. In the long run, however, Western expansion in non-Western countries brought demographic growth to the populations of these agricultural states. Eventually, new medical practices being introduced led to the tremendous reduction in death rates through the control of diseases. With a combination of the reduced death rates and high birth rates, this led to the increase in the population. Question number 15. Can you please describe some changes caused by globalization? Numerous changes occurred with globalization. The Roman Catholic Church played a major role in Latin American society during the colonial period. Spanish missionaries repressed the indigenous religious traditions of the native people and forced them to convert to Catholicism. Natives found a way to keep their own religion but add Catholic beliefs. The slaves that were imported from Africa to Latin America and the Caribbean brought traditional African religious beliefs and practices were also absorbed by Catholicism. All these traditions combining African religions and Catholicism are sometimes called Spiritism and are evident in parts of Latin America and the Caribbean. Question number 17. Describe independence in Africa. European colonial rule ended in Africa after World War II. By the 1700s, no fewer than 31 former colonies had won their independence. The first colony was in 1957, the West African nation of Guyana from Britain, led by Kwame Nkrumah. In 1960s, all of the West African countries were granted independence. In 1960, Belgium finally granted Congo its independence. In 1963, Kenya was granted its independence. Tanganyika, 1961, and in 1964 merged with Zanzibar to form the nation of Tanzania. Question number 20. Describe Latin America's social structure. Many traditional peasant communities maintain fictive kinship ties, which are social ties that provide mutual aid work groups for planting and harvesting crops and other economic and political activities. George Foster described one kinship tie in Mexican peasant communities known as dyadic contract, which is a reciprocal exchange arrangement between two individuals. Dyadic contracts can be established with people of equal or different status or with supernatural beings. One type of dyadic contract found in Latin America is known as compadrazgo, which is associated with the rites of passage of baptism and Catholicism. This institution, brought to the Americas through Catholicism, has become an integral aspect of Latin American social relationship. This was the start of what is known as godmothers and godfathers, or co-parents, which each child had one. Question number 21. Explain gender relationships in Latin America. The Spanish and Portuguese colonial experience have influenced gender relationships in Latin America. Machismo, which is an explicit code of behavior of Latin American males. True men, macho, are supposed to be courageous, aggressive, and superior to women. Women were supposed to be passive, sexually conservative and faithful, obedient, and completely devoted to their mate. However, that was not the case in these peasant communities. Question number 22. Can you please describe women living in rural areas of Africa? Women who lived in rural areas of Africa were placed in a subordinate status. In 1988, women provided about 60 to 80% of the household food needs in many parts of Africa. The workload increased after colonization and independence, working 10 to 12 hours a day. The lack of formal education prevented females from entering the wage labor economy, unable to purchase property and send their children to school, only given land through the relationship of males. Despite providing much of the agricultural labor and household food needs, women in rural Africa were considered the poorest people of one of the poorest countries. Question number 23. Can you describe women living in urban areas of Africa? Compared to the women of the rural area, The women of urban regions received formal education and tend to be more independent than those of the rural areas. Women of the urban areas were employed in urban markets. Some educated women had been self employed entrepreneurs. However, some of these educated women were confined to the service sector of the urban economy. Others, without formal education and lacked the support of extended families and village communities, had a hard time. Some African women are employed as domestics in white homes or as textile workers, earning less than 20% of the minimum wage. However, they are currently receiving much more attention by the government. Let's take a little commercial break and we'll be right back.
Any day now.
Really? You're eating Doritos? He's eating Doritos on my ultrasound. Do you see what I have to do?
I know.
Give me that.
Nikila, thank you for attending my show today. It was an honor having you. Thank you for having me on the Nikila Show. It was a great honor and pleasure to share my knowledge with those of your studio audience and those viewing in America. Thank you for coming today to see the wonderful Nikila run dancing and my lovely self. Good night, everybody, and see you guys here tomorrow on the Nikila Show, where it's always a beautiful day. Bye.